University this morning for what I hope will be a really interesting day. We're going to talk about race, wealth, and home ownership. And to get us started this morning, I want to introduce our president, Xavier University, Dr. Colleen Hanich, who's going to get us started.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Liz. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Race, Wealth, and Home Ownership Conference today. As much as we yearn to be able to return to in-person gatherings once COVID truly retreats, I think there's a silver lining in being able to gather virtually without some of the travel associated with coming together in person. So thank you very much for everyone who's been able to be with us today. This is going to be a very important conversation about the wealth gap in our region. And as you may know, I'm new to my role as president here at Xavier, having started in the summer, and am just so proud the more I learn about the role that Xavier has played and will continue to play in convening and supporting this community, especially as we commit ourselves to creating a more just, equitable, and balanced region for all of our neighbors. So we certainly value the partnership with our event co-conveners, the Housing Opportunities Made Equal, HOME, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, the Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, of course, the Urban League, and the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. And I particularly want to thank Xavier's Brueggemann Center for Dialogue and the Community Building Institute for championing this issue on behalf of the university. This conference is a wonderful opportunity for our students to learn alongside such a distinguished group of professionals. So we are honored today to be joined by Mr. James Cunningham, the regional administrator for HUD's Midwest Regional Office. And he will deliver the keynote address later today. And I know we're going to hear some wonderful remarks at lunch. Again, I want to welcome all of you to this space and to this moment. I hope that you hear something that resonates and challenges you to consider your role in these issues. We all have something to contribute, but something that encourages you that real change is possible, and that together we will create more opportunities for Black households in particular to build wealth through home ownership. And of course, to find the homes and communities that will support all of our families. I often draw upon the words of Margaret Mead when a project can sometimes seem a little too big or too overwhelming, and we wonder if positive change is even possible. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." So I would now like to introduce Dr. James Buchanan, our Director Emeritus of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue, who will introduce today's sessions. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dr. Hanich, for your welcome. Good morning. I am James Buchanan. Many of you will know me from my 19 years during which I was director of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier. And like President Hanich, I would like to welcome you. Everyone who is attending this symposium knows that there's a crisis in affordable housing, not just here in Cincinnati, but across the country. And everyone here knows that there are many governmental and non-governmental agencies and organizations who are working on this crisis. The issue, as it has typically been dealt with, is that there simply is not sufficient number of affordable places to live for those who need them. This is certainly the case. But the fundamental claim that is at the heart of this symposium is that the way the U.S. has typically gone about addressing this crisis is akin to a doctor who treats the symptoms of a disease and not the disease itself. There's a deeper crisis than the lack of the availability of affordable housing, and that is that the most significant indicator of racism in the United States is the wealth gap between the Black and brown communities and the white communities. In 2019, white households owned or controlled about 85.5% of the wealth in the US, while Black households controlled about 4.2%, and Hispanic households controlled only about 3.1%. There are many factors that have and do contribute to this terrible inequity, but we know from all of the studies that home ownership and the number of years families have owned their homes is the largest single predictor of the gap in wealth. Let me repeat that. That home ownership and the number of years families have owned their homes is the largest predictor of the wealth gap. The issue of the wealth gap is complex, and there are many issues such as income, education, and others that have contributed to it. There's also a long history from chattel slavery through 40 years, 40 acres and a mule, through the Tulsa massacre, to what happened to our own West End community here in Cincinnati that have contributed, all of which have stifled the African American community's ability to develop wealth. We are here to address one of these that is central to the issue. For most Americans, building equity through home ownership is the cornerstone of their ability to generate wealth. In 2019, which is the last figures we have, in Cincinnati alone, around 73% of the white population owned their own homes, while only 42% of the black population owned their own homes. That, I submit, is a snapshot of the wealth gap in America. If we want to address systemic racism in the USA, we have to address the wealth gap. And if we want to address the wealth gap, we have to address the issue of home ownership. How do we move an affordable housing system that is overwhelmingly a rental-based system in which the renter never is able to gain equity or build wealth to one where they have the opportunity to own a home and the corresponding opportunity to build wealth? We will not only explore these issues today, but we want to try to come up with some action steps that we might take in our own communities to begin to change the system. We're very happy that you've chosen to join us for this symposium today. Now, just a few housekeeping issues. Remember that throughout the symposium, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat, which you will see on the right-hand side of your screen, and the box for your own comments are down at the bottom of that. Secondly, throughout the day, we will be giving away gift cards to Black-owned businesses around Cincinnati. The one condition is you have to be present to win one of those. Third, remember that in order to be an audience, you have to click on the stage button. All of you who are here have obviously already figured that out, but if you hear from a friend or a colleague who's having difficulty getting on, remind them to click stage. And that pertains also to panelists. People after your panel is over, you have to log out, log back on, and log in through stage. Let me thank the funders for the symposium. First is the Campus Animators Fund, which is a program that was initiated by the President's Office, which picks a theme each year and funds a variety of programs on that theme. Secondly is the Provost Office and Dr. Melissa Bauman for her support. Third, Union Savings Bank and the Guardian Savings. Without the generous support of these organizations, events such as these would not be possible. We are so grateful. I also want to thank the whole planning committee who has worked for many, many months on putting this symposium together. And finally, I want to thank Emma, Shari McNamara, and Laura Castillo, who you will not see, but they're working in the background and they're the reason the technology is working. So without further ado, let's begin the symposium and welcome again. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this session. This is the opening session, the session that will provide the context, the regional context for our discussion about race, wealth, and home ownership. I'm Robert Killens, Jr. From the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for this session. And I have three wonderful and highly qualified panelists to speak on the subject at hand. So with no further ado, we're going to go in order. We'll first have Ms. Kristen Baker. She will lead us off. So Kristen, if you can just provide maybe in 3 to 4 minutes, your introduction and some regional context about the situation that we are addressing today, race, wealth, and homeownership.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. Really happy to be with you virtually. I'm Kristen Baker. I'm the Executive Director of LISC Greater Cincinnati, and one of the also on the Planning Committee, and really happy to be with this group to talk about sort of what's happening in the region right now, particularly with respect to homeownership in our region. So we at LISC have helped, along with Greater Cincinnati Foundation and other key partners, have created a housing strategy for Hamilton County called Housing Our Future. And in Housing Our Future, we talk about the importance of homeownership, particularly for Black Americans, and the important resource that homeownership is for building wealth. So that is a direct correlation, obviously, to what this conference is talking about. And I just want to provide a couple of quick data points for you to kind of level set what we're talking about here. So this first slide shows us some figures around cost burden. And so let me just make sure that everyone is operating from the same understanding of cost burden. Essentially what we're saying for households that are cost burdened is that they're spending more than 30% of their monthly income on their housing expenses. So that includes everything from rent or mortgage to your utilities, insurance, et cetera. And the benchmark is really that you want to spend 30% or less of your monthly income on your on those expenses, because if folks are spending upwards of 30, 40, 50, 60% of their monthly income on their housing costs, if there's a financial crisis or somebody needs supplies or school supplies, or there's a medical emergency, that really can put a strain on your budget. So in Hamilton County, 30% of our households are considered cost burdened. That means what I just described above. So 102,000 households, that's quite a few. And 49,000 of those are severely cost burdened. So that means more than 50% of their monthly income is going towards those expenses. Just to kind of ground you in the numbers that we're talking about here. We can go to the next slide. And inside those numbers, so of the cost burden households that we just talked about, 38% of those are homeowners and 62% are renters. 47% have incomes less than $20,000 a year. So if you think about what their monthly household expenses are, if you're only making $20,000 a year, that's a pretty tight budget. And 42% of them have incomes between $20,000 and $50,000. So just want to ground folks in sort of the math here and what we're talking about in this conversation, which is that we have many households paying far too much of their income towards rent. We don't necessarily have housing available at those price points. If you're making less than $50,000 a year, it's incredibly difficult to secure a mortgage if you were interested in pursuing homeownership. So we have some real facts here that I think can help guide the conversation today. And when we hear about the solutions that might be possible to bring more folks into homeownership, let's also remember what income ranges we're talking about and some of the price points that we're referencing. So I'll pass it back to you, Robert. I think I took my 2 minutes and then some.
No, that was great. Thank you, Kristen, for putting that context on this issue of being cost burdened. It's a very important and key issue. So now we'll have Mr. Greg Johnson, who will join us. Mr. Johnson is the CEO of the Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority. Mr. Johnson, why don't you provide some context for our discussion this morning?
Well, thank you, Robert. And I also want to say thank you, Christian, for that great kickoff. And it actually lends right into some of the discussion that I'm going to cover. We are talking about homeownership, but I think Dr. Buchanan, I know, he actually expounded on the wealth gap. And one of the things that I want to just point out and talk about, it's going to be preferred to or targeted at rental housing, but it's going to give an even in-depth picture of where we are as far as the Black and brown wealth gap in our community. Next slide. So as Robert said, I'm the CEO of Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, and I just wanted to give out a couple of numbers when, and as Christian has pointed out, having enough housing throughout our community on what some of our wait list numbers. On our Housing Choice Voucher, we have over 6,000 people currently today. and we have over 500 people out searching for a unit that actually have a voucher. In our public housing portfolio, we have over 9,000 families that are on the waiting list. And I will remind you that some of these families are on both waiting lists, but that just shows the various need in our community for additional affordable housing, additional wealth gap barriers as well. Next slide. So I think this slide tells the real picture. If you're looking at, and if you can remember the numbers that Kristen just gave out, she was at $50,000. The median income in our community is $60,000. And you look at what voucher holders and families that live in some of the assisted housing, what the average income is. It's well below the poverty level and well below any target market of trying to reach any wealth and or the dreams of homeownership. And you can look at the average age. So the average age is not 60, 70, or 80. The average age are individuals, working individuals, and we have to be able to work together to address and do something about it. And I put this last marker there just to be sure that we know that we have families and individuals in our community that have disabilities. We cannot get away from providing wealth, homeownership opportunities, and equitable rental opportunities to those individuals and families. And just taking a snapshot of how many with disabilities on our voucher program is 22%, and asset management is 20%. So to kind of give you a perspective of what those numbers are, we have over 11,000 vouchers in Hamilton County and just shy of 5,000 units that we offer in Hamilton County. And a large portion of our units that we offer are helping families and individuals with disabilities. So just to kind of give a framework, but what I want everybody to remember and look at as we talk about this further is the gap between how much do you really need to maintain and then how much are families really making. So I'll turn that back over to you, Robert.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That's extremely important context that'll be helpful as we move through the day. And next, we are fortunate to have Mr. Mark Kylander. Mark is the Regional Data and Policy Manager for the Cincinnati, USA Regional Chamber. And Mark, I just want to say again, thank you for the Chamber's addition to this discussion on housing, embracing growth principles for regional housing, because I think sometimes folks think that this is just an urban core or just a Cincinnati or even just a Hamilton County problem. And I think your work shows that it is far beyond just those things. So Mark Kylander, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for Xavier for putting this on, and I'm happy to join these distinguished guests on the panel. I'll try to keep this as short as I can. I would encourage anybody who is interested in the work that the Chamber has done recently on housing. You can visit our webpage, cincinnatichamber.com, and scroll down. There'll be a link to the Embracing Growth report, the data that I'm going to share with you today. It's all referenced in there and much, much more. So as we're talking about regional context for race and wealth and home ownership, what we wanted to do is provide what's happening in the housing market generally. The chart that I'm sharing with you now looks at the annualized housing unit growth rate for the last decade and compares it to the population growth rate for each of the places that we have listed on here. And just to note, this is the metropolitan statistical area for each of these places. So this is our entire Cincinnati MSA compared to the MSAs across the country. And what we're trying to do is help illustrate the fact that as we're facing a nationwide housing shortage and more acutely a region-wide housing shortage, we also have relatively low production of new housing coming online into the market across every income level and home ownership or rental type. Right now, we see ourselves straddling an in-between space between these sort of moderate growth Midwestern regions, the Columbus, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, Kansas City group, and some of the legacy regions that are starting to see either stagnant growth or even in some cases negative growth, the St. Louis, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. So some of what we're going to hear about through the whole day is about the shortage of available affordable housing, and that is certainly a main topic and ought to be part of the conversation. But it's also important to realize that we have a shortage of every kind of housing. And one of the ways to help build out of this is to bring new production online. There's a number of ways that we can talk about doing that as a community, but it's a really key and important factor to remember that what we're talking about is a supply and demand model. And one of the ways that we can help on the demand side is by bringing new supply. So we hope to, as a region, figure out what are the solutions that we can provide that help move Cincinnati up the chain, more up and to the right, and find ways to prevent Cincinnati from moving further back into some of the other direction that regions like St. Louis, Cleveland, Pittsburgh have gone. We'll do the next slide. The other component of this that's really important for us to talk about is the changing nature of what housing affordability is. Kristen is exactly right with what we should be talking about around the definitions of affordability. It's how much money do you have to spend from your income to be able to afford where it is that you live. And right now, as we look across what's happening in the Cincinnati region, costs for housing and rent are increasing faster than income. The more that this continues to take place, the more of a challenge that we as a region will face in terms of finding overall affordability. So what's the solution for this? Really, it's twofold. What are the ways that we can reduce the growth, this really rapid growth of housing costs on the homeowner and the renter side? So we have to bend those cost curves down. And the other part of this is incomes. Incomes have risen, but they just haven't kept up with the expensive increases in housing. How is it that we as a community can figure out ways to boost incomes and reduce housing costs so that eventually this yellow line is going to intersect and pass those two blue lines? That's really what the long-term solution, sustainable solution for making housing more affordable is in our region. Robert?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. That was very important. You introduced some very important principles there. So, and I want to start there. So, and I want each of you to sort of address the same issue, but from a unique perspective. So, we talked about that we have a growth in housing costs, rent, etc., that's grown quite quickly. The recent report, the Housing Our Future, and work the list did back in 2017, at that time said that housing costs were up 46% and wages only 19%. So there's quite a gap there. So Mark, we'll start with you. Can you just address this from the impact that you see this from the chamber's perspective, especially having on employers? The fact that employees that they need are struggling with the housing costs and how that's impacting their businesses and the broader economy as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that I think we're seeing more employers starting to pay attention to. There's obviously a ton of shock that's happening in the labor market given COVID, and even before COVID, where the availability of workers was incredibly difficult to find. Many of these things are in flux and look to be in flux for a while for a variety of factors. But I think there are employers who are waking up to the idea that there are barriers other than what a wage looks like that prevent employees from coming to work every day. We have a great initiative at the Cincinnati Chamber. It's called the Workforce Innovation Center. Again, all of this information is on our website if anybody is interested in finding out more about it. That helps employers take an assessment essentially of what is it that is driving some of the workforce challenge that they face in their business. Is it the availability of childcare for their employees? So if one of their workers has to miss a day because they have a sick kid and are not able to take them to childcare and don't have any other options, well, if there's a policy in place that is attendance based, and it's a 3 strikes and you're out kind of situation, that ends up being a workforce issue, because this is the same employer that's coming to us and saying, I can't find employees to work for me. So what we have at the Workforce Innovation Center is really a consultative practice that helps businesses understand the variety of factors and how can we change process and policy on the business side to help make it better for their employees to maintain a positive working environment, and also figure out ways to provide paths of upward mobility. Ultimately, again, going back to the affordability piece of this, we're going to have to figure out how to boost wages and incomes. Providing pathways of upward mobility to current workforce and employees is one of the best ways that we can do that. And that's something that businesses can take the opportunity to do, to invest in right now. And honestly, we can make a business case for why businesses should be doing this. There's a return on investment to having a stable workforce that we're really starting to show through the Workforce Innovation Center. So we're starting to see employers pay a little bit more attention to this. Our hope is that as we continue to have community-wide conversations, that more businesses will understand that the housing market and ecosystem is a really dynamic part of what the workforce system looks like. So having people who live in housing that's able to connect them to a high wage job, that's going to be a really important part of the solution. So we're hopeful that we'll see more employers who can jump on board with that idea, and conversations like this, I think, are really important to help us make that happen.
Wow, thank you, Mark. Appreciate again what you and the chamber are doing. So now let me come to you, Kristen. First, I just want to again say thank you for your leadership in particular, and LISC overall, LISC Cincinnati Northern Kentucky's championing and bringing forth the Housing Our Future study. So thank you for quarterbacking that. What I want you to address is that what many people may not recognize, that amongst the many over 100 recommendations that that study put forth, so we encourage everyone to look at it, you encourage the community to look at boosting the minimum wage. Can you just amplify that and maybe build on what Mark was saying about how that impacts the housing market?
Yes, thanks, Robert. Absolutely. So, in the research that we conducted to help ground us in what are solutions around the housing challenges we're facing in our county, we found that 4 out of the 5 most frequently occurring jobs in our region don't currently pay enough to afford median 2-bedroom rent on an apartment, so around $832. 4 out of 5 jobs. These are the jobs that were keeping us alive during the height of the pandemic, when many of us were, isolating and distancing. These are customer service jobs, folks working in healthcare, folks working in these main jobs of sort of sustaining our economy, and they are not making enough to afford housing. Only 1 of those jobs pays enough to afford a median mortgage in our market. So I think that's a really important fact for folks to understand and zoom in on, that, as Mark was saying, we are hearing from employers the challenges of filling key roles and kind of keeping the workforce vibrant. And if those jobs are not paying enough to meet people's needs, to meet the cost of housing that the market is driving right now, we're missing the mark here. So we really think that figuring out how to really encourage higher wages and also more tools to help folks get into, particularly into homeownership, first-time homeownership, how do we really get some of those tools to be used most robustly and also with some flexibility is really important. Our housing production is a critical piece of this puzzle. We're just not bringing enough online. As Mark said, we're not producing enough housing at every price point. And that is also tied to workforce, because we know that there are major challenges in getting, folks going into the construction sector. These are great jobs. These are jobs, particularly if you get a certification, you can really do quite well. And we really need to figure out how to open up that pipeline more too, and bring more people in, because this is also an economic development role, bringing more housing into the market, right? It benefits both sides. It's creating more jobs that pay a good wage, and it's bringing more units into the market. So we really have to think about this creatively, I think, and recognize that that we have some work to do, frankly, to kind of tend to both things at once.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kristen. Great context. Mr. Johnson, as you heard Kristen talking about the economic opportunities that this provides, can you provide just some context? Because I'm not sure many people appreciate the level of impact the CMHA has in terms of the economic opportunity it's producing with preserving and trying to produce new units, and also the work opportunities through Section 3 for businesses and employment.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I can. I just would like to kind of, piggyback on what Mark and Kristen had said about the ecosystem. And so, if you really think about this, and when you interject CMHA and some of the things that we're trying to do with, when you talk about livable wage, when you talk about job creation, how do you do that in our community the best way, the most thoughtful way? And then the one thing I don't, and I want to make sure I reiterate and not forget, when you're talking about employees and employers, flexibility is the new word, and we can't say daycare enough. I think we can see in our national news that daycare is a huge, huge barrier for individuals and families to get and maintain a job. But as far as Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, the housing authorities across the country, we were created through the New Deal. The New Deal was when the Depression was in America, and it was about job creation and creating jobs at and above a livable wage. And so when you think about what can Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority do to help further that, obviously providing quality, affordable housing, but being thoughtful about how do we help our local economy, and which includes our residents, Section 3, MBE, and WBE, expand and increase their wealth, because all of these categories fall into our ecosystem. Mark couldn't have said it even better and showing his graphs. And as Christian said about people that are below $50,000, and how do we move people that are at 26 and go over $50,000. So now we're moving and our ecosystem is working properly. So at Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority, we've started this $1 billion renovation, which will, and it's not all public money. It's public-private partnerships that we're trying to insert in our community. Obviously, the units and the quality of our units and what we're providing to families and individuals, we want to increase that. But the next obvious thing is job creation and insurging into quality, high paying jobs. And as Christian's graph showed, we need more of those type of jobs. And then how do you sustain those jobs? So with the creation and the influx of doing new construction, and then having a bolsterous Section 3 MBE programs, we're able and we're starting to make sure that we're creating those opportunities for small minority-owned businesses, small businesses, Section 3 businesses, and the residents that live at CMHA, which I think through this whole process are the most important. If you remember and you look at the numbers that I created about average income levels, here again, we're imploding and making better that entire ecosystem. And that's one of the things that we're doing here. But as one of the solutions on how are we creating wealth for smaller businesses. And the idea is to take a $25,000 a year business, and hopefully they grow to $150,000. Now, when you look at Mark's graph, now those lines of income start to come together as a community, and then a lot of positive things happen. So, here at CMHA, with the leadership of the board, we've been able to sit down and look at how do we change our current platform and put and position the organization in a position to increase and make that ecosystem better, not only from a product housing standpoint of current new build, but also job training and job creation. And then you're talking about sustainability because a person has knowledge and the skill set to maintain and keep going forward.
Well, thank you, Mr. Johnson. And I think a couple of things stood out there. You said, I just want to make sure you said billion with a B, right? In terms of the investment that
Yeah,
CMHA
yeah.
okay.
Across the country, an all public housing authority. So if you kind of get this around your head, it's 30 billion.
Wow.
So it's 30 billion. So if you think about the opportunity across the country to invest and merge the public-private partnerships, not only are you going to increase quality affordable housing, increase affordable housing, which is needed, and then at the back end with the supplies and the job creation, if we can just focus on that, but across the nation, it's estimated to be at 30 billion. And we're trying to insurge and bring together just a small billion.
It's a small billion. I like a small billion. So you talked about a very important piece, and that is skills so that people can move up. Related to this whole issue, and we've used the word, each of you, ecosystem several times. So Mark, I want to come back to you. The chamber has led the effort around transportation because we know that's vital to our economy. It's vital to the chamber's members. But can you talk about transportation in terms of how it impacts the jobs, the economy, and people being able to get an affordable unit and then be able to get to work in order to maintain that housing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the reasons that we decided to get more involved in housing, is because we'd spent the last really 6 or 7 years being heavily invested in improving the public transit environment here in the Cincinnati region. This culminated with the passage of Issue 7 in 2020 in Hamilton County, which provided a countywide funding stream to SORTA, which is Southwest Ohio Regional Transit Authority, which operates Metro, the bus system here in Hamilton County. And now we're starting to even think about what does a regional transportation system look like that better connects our suburban communities in places like Butler and Warren counties to the north and northern Kentucky with a lot of the job opportunities that exist throughout the region. And again, these are those high wage, high opportunity jobs that employers are having a hard time filling. So what we thought about as we passed Issue 7 and started thinking about what does this look like in an implementation phase, employers asked the chamber to provide some leadership in the community because they know that they couldn't get workers to jobs. Well, at the end of the day, that person who we're trying to get to a job on transit, they live in some sort of housing unit. So having a housing environment and ecosystem that aligns with the transportation system that we're trying to build, that's ultimately how we provide connectivity. And it's not just jobs, it's healthcare, it's education, it's childcare, it's all of the goods and services that people need to have a prosperous life throughout the region. So what we're calling for, and it's all in our report again, is we need a region that implements what we call transit-oriented development. This is a concept that's been proven nationally. There are other places in the country that are doing it really well. Just up the road from us in Indianapolis, they're really doing a fantastic job of this. But this is designing a housing environment, a built environment that connects where people live with the ways to get them to all of those opportunities, job, education, healthcare, whatever else it is. So the more policies that we can be doing around transit-oriented development, the better off that we're going to be in that broader ecosystem. The other piece of this is that over the long run, it's much, much more affordable to use public transportation than it is to own, operate, and maintain a car. So as we're talking about limited household resources and the affordability of housing, if we can trim one of those expense categories for household budgets, which would be transportation, and have a transportation system that does provide that connection through bus rapid transit and really reliable routes in the first place that provide that connection, that's going to help us with what this affordability challenge looks like throughout the region. So transportation, housing, really, it's two pieces of the same conversation. So we're excited about some of the opportunity that we have in front of us. It's gonna be a lot of hard work to implement a system that does this well, but we think there's a lot of momentum to do this right now, and we have to seize the opportunity to make sure that we're doing this in a way that works for everybody.
Well, thank you, Mark. Kristen, I know you were chomping at the bit when Mark said transit-oriented development, that around the country LISC has been a leader in this. So we're going to give you 30 seconds on that. But what I want you to address after that is, and Mr. Johnson said it, he said we couldn't say daycare or childcare enough. I want you to address that as it relates to both this issue of housing as well as access to jobs and the complications of not having enough and robust childcare.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, transit-oriented development is really important for vibrant communities and neighborhoods. And I would just say, if anyone's interested in learning more, LISC has a lot of resources on our national website, lisc.org. But pivoting to early childhood, childcare, I think that that it is something that's near and dear to me as a parent, as a mother, and something that I know is generally, particularly in the communities where LISC works, we know it is just a huge challenge because and it's also a workforce issue right now, right? There are major challenges that are great partners that provide high quality early childhood and after school experiences are struggling to fill these roles, even with resources available through the preschool promise levy and other, other subsidies and tools that are available to try and help make this cost more affordable. It is still a huge hole. I think we have a lot of vacancies right now in that sector because the wages, the value proposition is high for this. We know how important this is, but it's an expensive endeavor. Childcare is generally, one of your biggest expenses outside of your housing costs and your transportation. So we have to figure out how to make those resources accessible for families, particularly those who are working perhaps at a different shift. Maybe they're working the swing shift, maybe they're working nights, maybe, and of course, families want the best for their children, right? They want their children to be in environments where they are cared for, where they're nurtured, where they know they can feel safe, that they are in the right place for them. And so that means different kinds of options. A center is not necessarily the choice that every family wants to make for their child. So how do we support in-home care providers to make sure they're getting resourced and equipped to provide high quality experiences? How do we provide that in various ways all around the community? It's a huge challenge. So between the wages and the shortage of workers that we have in this space, combine that with, frankly, with the challenges that COVID has presented and that we have to provide because our youngest are not able to get vaccinated yet. We have to really work on distancing. There's all of those components that centers and childcare providers now have to wrestle with, plus the cost and the availability and the location of that care is also a lot to, it's a big factor. And when we have, particularly for perhaps households that are, have a single head of household, that challenge becomes even more great. So we also, again, going back to workers and workforce, thinking about employers, how are they being flexible with parents and childcare providers or, folks that are caregiving for children in their lives? That's something that's important too. So it all fits together. And we also know this impacts Black households more than it does white households. Just as every other issue we're talking about, the disparity exists. It is real. It is something we need to keep calling forward and identifying that the solutions that we have presented in the past perhaps are not the right ones. So let's go back to the drawing board and figure out collectively and what we need to do to make sure that we're providing those resources to families where they need them and when they need them.
Oh, that's excellent. So speaking of that, resources and this issue of location, transit, etc. Mr. Johnson, can you talk a little bit about what CMHA has been doing, mindful of this and mindful of that housing is needed everywhere, that you've been trying to do to expand the locations that you serve and when you develop housing and new housing?
Well, thank you for that, Robert. And I just, if I could just take 30 seconds to piggyback off of Christian and the daycare as well.
Oh, sure.
Um, um, One of the stats that I put out is people with disabilities. People with disabilities have kids, and those kids have disabilities, and the daycare cost for them is even higher, and their ability to find quality daycare so they can actually go to work is a large issue that we have in our community. And this folds into the housing piece as well. So it's a dual issue or wealth gap issue for those families and individuals. And we have to make sure we put our heads together and not forget about that whole population when we're talking about affordability. The affordability for disabilities costs a little more. So as what we call mainstream costs are going up, those costs are going up even higher because of what some of the points that Kristen pointed out, and that is the workers that work in that field and how much do they actually get offered to continue to do that difficult work. We have to make sure we recognize, address, and help those organizations with additional revenue so they can offer employees more money so we can keep a meaningful field of individuals that are willing to continue to do that difficult and important work in our community. But to your question, as far as what we've been doing the last few years is trying to make sure that our last few developments have been out in the county, which have been very, very successful. Springdale community, Green Township community, Coleraine Township, Mount Healthy, and all those communities have been really good partners. And that housing has been workforce housing, senior housing, disabled for disabilities, which has been very, very important housing. And now we're working on another workforce development right in downtown in Cincinnati, which we're really, really excited about, which we know that housing is really needed. But when you look at, as we look at, where and how to develop and where it's needed, it is just like Mark and Christian has talked about. Transportation is the number one. What we look at is how can people, how do they have access? What type of transportation? And then one of the new things that we have to look out is the hours that the transportation is available. And then in close proximity, what type of jobs are close to potential housing? Meaning, is it jobs that need a GED or jobs that need a 2-year degree, or is it jobs that need a 4-year degree? And what is the mix of that? And what type of housing are we trying to develop to make sure that families and individuals can be successful in their needs? The other thing, as Mark was talking on his point, when you talk about transportation and transportation needs and the cost for transportation, the other thing that we're looking at is parking. The cost of parking has gone up astronomically over the last few years. And for a community that has not done a whole lot of residential, there's a couple things: zoning, and then a lot of residential and multifamily new development. We have a lot of old stock in our community, and that old stock is under old parking rules. Well, for a country and a community that has more cars today, what we have is a parking issue, and that parking issue is growing astronomically, because now when people get a job and now when they have access to buying a car, the issue is, where do I park it and how do I keep it safe? So it's the transportation part is more than just we got to find transportation and move people. We also have to figure out, how do we change some of our zoning to come up to the times where people, right now where they are, how can they, obtain additional parking? And then at the end of the day, making sure that that parking is affordable, because we all know in small supply, high demand, costs go up. So but some of the things, those are the things that we've been thinking about and that we're tackling with our new development. And then as we're doing our rehab as well, we have to address all of those issues. And we've been very fortunate to have good partnerships in the communities that we went to and talked to so far on the new development.
Well, I want to build on that, Mr. Johnson. So thank you about talking about the regional nature and doing things outside of just the core, outside of the city. So I want to come back to you, Mark. Mark, one of the, I think, powerful contributions that embracing the regional principles for growth did was show that in very concrete way that this is not simply an urban core or a Hamilton County issue. It's a regional issue, and the issue of cost burden affects the whole MSA. So if you would, can you just for a minute, because I want to move us into talking about funding. That's the boogeyman, so we got to get to that. But Mark, can you just talk a little bit about the regional nature again of this issue?
Yeah, happy to. And Greg, it's so good to hear you mention some of those other communities in Hamilton County who have decided to take a step and get involved, because too often the conversation around housing and affordability has been primarily focused on, well, it's a city of Cincinnati only for long-term housing affordability, not just for the residents who live there now, but for the residents who might be coming in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I would say that the challenge that we are facing right now in this country around housing, it's not because of the last 5 or 10 years of policy decisions. It's really the last 60 or 70 years of policy decisions. So as we think about a community that embraces all of these principles together, what are the time horizons that we're using to make those calculations? And what are the geographic distributions as well? So in the 7 largest counties in the region, this would be the 4 in Southwest Ohio, Hamilton, Claremont, Butler, and Warren, and the 3 in Northern Kentucky, Boone, Clinton, and Campbell. That's where 90% of our region's population lives. Right now, cost burden rates for any of those counties are anywhere for homeowners. We're looking at 12 to 22% of homeowners who have a mortgage. They're currently cost burdened. That's more than their 30% of their income are going to their housing expenses. For renters, we're looking at anywhere from 33% all the way up to close to 50% of renters, and that's in Campbell County, Kentucky, are cost burdened. So I would say to any local leader who says, we don't really have a housing affordability issue, I would come back to them and say, yes, you do. You might not be able to see it in a way that is present, but even as we look at tracking this data over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a really dramatic shift. And again, as those gaps expand between housing costs and incomes, it's only going to include more and more households in every community. So really, it's about providing region-wide solutions in figuring out how every community can make intentional strides in addressing the challenges that are in front of us and so present. So it's not just one problem or one jurisdiction that gets to solve the problem. Now, we know that different jurisdictions need to do things a little bit differently. We know, for example, in Hamilton County, in the city of Cincinnati, some of the challenges in front of us are more acute, but every community needs to be thinking about doing this in a very, very intentional way with those proper time horizons and perspectives, thinking about who lives here now and who might live here in the future, and who's going to have an opportunity to afford where it is that they live.
Wow, thank you. I think that was very very powerful, Mark. Thank you, because I think too often people think it's just an urban core or just somebody else's issue, but it's a regional issue for all of us. So, Kristen, Mr. Johnson talked about several communities outside of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. I know LISC has been partnering with Hamilton County and other counties, because your work doesn't stop at the county line or at the river. You do work and support communities in northern Kentucky as well. But can you just talk a little bit about some of those communities outside of Cincinnati where that they really are trying to take this bull by the horns and make a difference, and the work that LISC is doing to support them?
Yep, happy to. Thanks, Robert. So we have been partnering with Hamilton County government to offer some services to jurisdictions outside of the city of Cincinnati. So many of our first ring suburban jurisdictions that, as Mark indicated, we're seeing changes in the housing market, in the community, in the population, and they want to respond and welcome the new neighbors that are joining their community, that are folks that have many perhaps who have come from other parts of the city of Cincinnati. As the market has changed there and the price has become unaffordable to them, we're really happy that these jurisdictions are saying, we want to be part of the solution. So we've created so far 5 housing action plans in partnership with Hamilton County Planning and Development and the Community Building Institute at Xavier to really help them understand what does their market look like now and where are their opportunities. So how can we help create new kinds and types of housing in these places? The part of this that's also complicated, particularly as we think about home ownership, is that inside the city of Cincinnati, the housing stock is of a certain age. It's more pre-World War II. It's older. It certainly has many challenges, but the quality is such that it's often, incredibly expensive to renovate and update, but it's a worthwhile endeavor. Houses inside, particularly in the first ring suburbs, a lot of that was built post World War II as a response to, GIs coming home, and also a place where we know racism, intentional racist policies prevented Black soldiers and veterans from being able to participate and benefit in the home ownership opportunities that were provided. That housing it's really outlived its useful life. And so it's just wasn't built to last the same way. So there's challenges there too in terms of quality. One thing we're seeing in these county places, I just want to share, I know everyone loves data, I want to share just a little bit more, that in the county, there is a pretty significant gap in Black and white home ownership. Home ownership overall countywide has dropped in the last 10 years, just 2 percentage points, from 60% to 58%. But the rate of home ownership for Black households is 36 percentage points below that of white households. That's a really big difference. And even in communities like Silverton that we worked with, and I suspect there might be a friend or two from Silverton on this meeting today, Silverton has historically had a higher rate of Black home ownership than most other communities in the county, but that is still dropping over time. So we're seeing the market change, and we know that, and I'm sure later today we'll hear more about the rates of mortgage application for Black households are declined at a much higher rate than white. I mean, it's just the data all lines up to show that this is a challenge. And so in these county communities, they're saying, we want to provide more opportunities for home ownership. We also want to provide different kinds and types of housing to respond to the needs of our residents. So as seniors who might like to stay in Silverton or Cheviot or Deer Park say, I want to be here, but I don't want to own the home anymore. How do we create some more density, some more options, condominiums, apartments, et cetera, particularly along the business corridors, or also some sort of transit-oriented light development, right, along those transportation nodes where we know that bus rapid transit is going to be running? How do we really build up that to create a more vibrant, business district or sort of a live work area for folks to be? So I think that the counties, communities are really looking for us to rally around them and help them to really create and be the test, be the model for how we could do this work. It's just it takes a little bit of thoughtful planning first, and then figuring out how do we bring those tools to bear. So I think it's really important and exciting that we hear that these communities are saying, yes, we care and we want to have diverse housing options in our communities.
Well, that's great. You raised a point, so I want you each to give me just a 30-second on this, as because we're going to save the last 10 minutes or thereabout for talk about funding. You talked about not wanting to own the home, and we know that that's particularly an issue for seniors as they age, and we don't want them to. They may longer want to be homeowners, but they want to stay in the community where they raised their family, where they lived. Can you talk a little bit about thoughts about that as an issue? And then, Mark, I want you to chime in, and Mr. Johnson as well, on just that issue of seniors, if you want to give us a data point there.
Yeah, seniors, are really important, obviously a part of our community, and we know that baby boomers are aging, right? So that segment of the population is just going to continue to grow. And also those are folks whose income is going to be limited. I mean, we don't want to ask 75-year-olds to go out and try and get a job to keep up with the cost of housing. So we know folks, legacy homeowners in particular around the region, have really been impacted by the housing market changes, and they need tools if they want to stay in their home to be able to make those repairs at an affordable price point, particularly if they are income constrained. We want to make sure they understand how to transfer, if your house is your biggest source of wealth, how do we make sure that we're allowing people have the tools to understand how to, if they have a tangled title issue, have they left things in a trust, all of those, not the most exciting topics of conversation to have at dinner, but really important, because many families have lost houses when a loved one passes because they didn't have the right pieces in place to make sure the title transfer could happen and the wealth transfer could happen. So keeping that in mind, and then yes, how do we provide some other housing options for seniors that are that have the amenities that they need, the one story, all the extra supports that we want to make sure people have to age in place. How do we create new housing again in those places to facilitate that is really important. I'll pass it to Mark.
Yeah, all right, Mark.
I also would go back to some of what we're talking about in transportation too. And Kristen mentioned the D word, which I hadn't heard yet, which is density. We need density around some of these transit opportunities, particularly when it comes to senior housing and mobility too. Senior housing development can oftentimes be a controversial topic in neighborhoods, but the reality is solutions for what long-term affordable senior housing looks like often involve density, and they often involve transportation access as well. So as we're talking about what these really complicated systems looks like, those have to be key components of what the future of development looks like for this type of housing.
Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, so I'm going to make a comment and then kind of leave us with food for thought as we move on to our next subject. But the big picture is education. Even though we have communities in Hamilton County that are willing to listen, we need to do more education about what affordable housing, what it looks like, and why. When you're talking about seniors, reality-wise, we're making decisions and saying that people that want to stay in particular neighborhoods and areas, they can't because, one, affordability, and then if it's not affordability, it is having something to move to the next step, meaning I can't walk upstairs anymore. I need a single floor plan, and my neighborhood or community doesn't offer that to me. And that's because we haven't been forward thinking on the transition. And as Mark said, transition, transportation, and then Kristen brought in the density word. I was going to stay away from that, so I'll bring up another one. But I still think that we have, and I know you asked for 30 seconds, and I'll be real brief.
Yeah.
We still have a large barrier, and a large barrier is we have to talk about racism, classism, and we can come up with a lot of great plans, but at the end of the day, that education should help us with where we are as a community with those two items. If we can make a dent or put a dent in those two items in our community, we have smart enough people throughout our community that can figure out the other pieces. But I think we have to address that. I could repeat what Kristen said and Mark said. But at the end of the day, that's where we are when we're talking about moving the needle. So I'll leave it. I'll leave it at there so you can move on to your next subject.
Yes. No, thank you. Very rich discussion, and I couldn't leave the. Kristen mentioned Silverton, and and I couldn't just not mention Tom Carroll, who's been a leader on this issue in the county, and thank you for his leadership and others in other communities. But I needed to do that. So in our last few minutes, and I know we have to be really quick because Mr. Buchanan, Dr. Buchanan, and Liz, and everybody behind the scenes will boot us in about 4 minutes. So, Mark, can you just talk a little bit about housing needs funding, excuse me, and the kind of partnership you think we need to get this done, because it can't be all one way or the other. So can you
Yeah.
just give us a minute on that, please?
Yeah, and I'll be as really fast as I can here. Really, there isn't enough money right now that's available to solve the problem. It's too big. And we also cannot wait on places like Washington, D.C. or Columbus to come and rescue us. As we're seeing what's happening in Washington right now, it's really fruitless of us to think that that's going to be a long-term solution. There are some things that we can do that really don't cost as much money. And I'll bring the D word back up again. Density is how we can make a lot of this stuff happen. And we have a zoning and development policy framework right now that prohibits density in a way that we need to flip that paradigm and have new dense development that's going to support a broad range of income and investment. So there's also a really significant role that we need to do in terms of attracting private capital, because that is a bucket of funding that we can draw down resources. So market rate development also has to be part of whatever comprehensive solution that we're building as a region to address long-term affordability. Again, I go back to, it's about building a housing environment that holds those cost curves down. Market rate is a way that we can do it. So density and market rate are absolutely have to be two parts of the equation. And I just don't think we can wait on a bailout from somebody who's going to just bring large sums of money that this problem really does require to solve.
Thank you, Mark. Kristen, we had a failed effort to do a housing trust fund, but LISC has national resources, and we've heard from some of those. Can you talk about what you think is a blueprint for how we, at a high level, can do a public-private partnership around developing a housing trust fund for us in the region?
So just to kind of ground everyone, the city of Cincinnati does indeed have an affordable housing trust fund. There are some dollars in that fund. The gap still we have is that the mechanism to deploy and use those funds in projects has not yet been fully designed. So there are two kinds of funding that go into, the math around, particularly around affordable housing and also affordable home ownership, is that the cost of doing the project is far more typically than what you might be able to charge in rent on the renter side or in terms of the sale price. So many of our community development partners in the city of Cincinnati and beyond have worked to try and bring new units of home ownership online in neighborhoods like Madisonville and Walnut Hills and West End. And it might cost $250,000 to build a new home, but if you want to sell it to a homeowner that could afford around $150,000 mortgage, you have a hole there, right? And so borrowing money is never going to be the solution there. So we have to fill the gap with some funds, particularly typically government funds, local government funds, city funds, county funds, et cetera, are the best way to do that, because they're the first money in, and that gives the confidence to other investors or funders or philanthropic organizations, corporations, to say, yeah, we will pitch in too, right? So we have to figure out how to create also some more innovative lending tools for these kind of products where the money, we can be more patient, and we are not, investors always are looking for a return. Maybe they won't take a return, but maybe their money gets returned to them, right, whole at some point in time. So there's some different ways that we need to take a bite out of this apple, and it requires a big dollar amount. As Mark said, this is not cheap. So we need to just accept that we're not going to fix this with $1 million or $50 million, that it's patient. We have to take our time, but we have to make this investment if we're going to be able to influence all those other factors we talked about today. I know we're at time, so I'll stop talking.
Now we're at time. So Mr. Johnson, we're going to give you the last 30 seconds here, and I'll hopefully have 30 seconds before we get booted to wrap up. You have been partnering and leveraging government dollars with private sector dollars, and you've been doing a great job of it. Can you just talk a little bit about that as a blueprint, maybe for the last 30 seconds?
Yeah, over for the last 7 years, the board changed and updated our mission to build more public-private partnerships. And a lot of that was built on how do we garner and raise money to do some of the preservation projects that we're trying to do with all of our housing. And so we made a concerted effort to go out to talk to and build quality partnerships. And the way to do that, obviously, is to look at who is partners in the best interest of what you're trying to do and to accomplish. Kristen talked about homeownership. What are some of those gaps? Mark talked about, hey, we don't have enough money. But I think Kristen came up with, here's what we do have. We have time and planning. And so what we have to do is put a plan together and how to develop and continue to develop those public-private partnerships that will create and continue to invest in the development of the type of housing that we need in our region. And then the last thing I'll say about that is we have to think through and make sure that we're doing mixed income developments, not only for the short term, but for the long term and for the social issues, to try to negate those social issues. Because when we talk about expense, we usually talk about the bricks and mortars, but what we really need to think about, how can we relieve the pressure on calls for service on our EMT, hospitals, and the police department?
Well, Mr. Johnson, thank you. Thank you. You all were a wonderful panel. First, Kristen Baker, LISC, Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky. Thank you. Mark Kylander, Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber, and Mr. Greg Johnson, Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing. And it was a pleasure being the moderator. What I would close with is two things. And I think Mr. Johnson said it, everyone said it in their own way, but affordability is an important issue, and we need affordability at all price points and with all types of housing. And so not just one income segment, we need it across the board, and we need more of all housing to release some of the cost pressure. And finally, I'll say this: no matter what kind of position we came into this COVID pandemic, or what issue was important to us, whether we were advocates for children or advocates for education or social services, business development, you name it. What COVID has taught us that we all now have to be advocates for housing, because with this pandemic, we've needed housing not only for the normal sleeping functions, but we've needed it as a place to go to work, needed as a place to educate our children and to run businesses. So housing is so important. We hope that this panel sets up everyone for what will come later today. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for the panelists. And this session, we'll call it a wrap.
All right, y'all, we are off to a hot start. Take a break. We're going to be back at 10:20 for our next session, which will be on national models. And I also want to remind you, give you a little bit of an incentive. When you come back at 10:20, we're going to do our first drawing for gift certificates for Black-owned businesses in the region. We want to support those businesses, and we want to introduce you all to those businesses. So take a break, get something to drink, and come back at 10:20. 5 minutes.